Suzanne. I see Tim Johnson in the audience, and so I'm reminded when I was a kid, my father, he made his children learn. His great desire was that we'd be able to speak to anyone, talk to anyone. So he had us learn how to ask people questions, and so my older brother came up with a set of 5 questions that my younger brother and I ripped off of him, and so that we would go out and we would talk to people, and we would ask them like what they did, and did they like what they did, and things like this. And consequently, I've had many interview with taxidermists and sheetrock layers and farmers and all sorts of people. But one of them was one night when Robert Kennedy was a senator. He came to our house for dinner, and so I had to go through this little ritual, and I asked him what he did, and as a U.S. senator, and he said, well, you know, he told me all the things you normally would hear, but he said, basically, I'm kind of like mostly the guy who survived the Johnstown flood. And he said, you know about it, don't you, Robert? Well, actually, at that point, I'd never even heard of Johnstown, so I really didn't. And he said, you know, he survived the Johnstown flood. He lost his wife and his children, his home, his dog. He lost everything. And it really became, no pun intended, a watershed of history of his life. And so it became bigger and bigger as the years went by. And this is all he really wanted to talk to people about, is how he had survived the Johnstown flood. And he said, it's like this. He said, you know, he would stop anyone that would talk to him. Eventually, of course, he ends up in a nursing home. And he would sit by the door in his wheelchair, hoping someone new would come in and he could talk to him about how he had survived the Johnstown flood. And as happens in these stories, he eventually died, and he was checking into heaven with St. Peter. And they were going through all the paperwork, and he pointed out that, you know, things he liked and disliked, and they were going through it. And St. Peter said, is there anything you'd particularly like to do? And he said, well, not today or tomorrow, but if there's at some time in the future, I'd love to get a group together and talk to them about how I survived the Johnstown flood. I lost my house and my wife and my children and our dog. And St. Peter said, I think that'll be great. And people love to get together in heaven. And he was so encouraged after so many years of people avoiding him over this. And he said, really? And he said, yes. And he said, but I do need to warn you, anytime that there's ever a group gathering, Noah always seems to show up. And so I'm looking at here, Bill, and I'm looking at Tim and stuff, and I'm going, so, you know, I don't know if I feel so good about all these Noahs in the audience. About 12 years ago now, I was with a young friend, and we were driving down the historic east-west thoroughfare of Memphis, Poplar Avenue. Many of y'all know it. And I looked ahead, and 3 cars ahead was Shelby Foote. And I turned to my friend and I said, 3 cars ahead is Shelby Foote. He's the great interpreter of the American Civil War. I mean, you know, what he's done with his trilogy, what he's done at that point with the Ken Burns series, it's so important because he really is opening for an entire new generation an understanding of the American Civil War that was seeming to fade away. My friend said, which one is he? And I said, he's the one that's not 16. And so I said, there's a long light at North Parkway, and if the light's in my favor, I am going to jump out of the car and go introduce myself to Mr. Foote. And as fate would have it, the light was in my favor, and I jumped out of the car and ran up, and he was sitting in this Volkswagen convertible, Champagne edition at the time, and I said, Mr. Foote, I'm Robert Hicks, and I'm from Franklin, Tennessee, and I just want to tell you how much I really love what you've done. It's such an amazing thing. The trilogy is such an incredible work, and I just went on, and the only way I can describe the look on Mr. Foote's face was that of an assassination attempt. And eventually he said, and I'll never forget these words because they're very sentimental to me, he said, Mr. Hicks, I'm not accustomed to being accosted while sitting in my automobile. And so I did what I do when things aren't going well. You may notice it today. I just kept talking. And eventually, for whatever reason, Mr. Foote said, Mr. Hicks, if you would please go back and get in your automobile. You can follow me to my house and we'll sit around and tell lies. And I tell you that story because it was not only one of the great evenings in my life, but it was also maybe even more important to me because it was the first time I ever told someone I wanted to write a fictional account of the Battle of Franklin. You see, at this point there had probably been long and short dozens of books written about the Battle of Franklin. But few people, including most of the people in Franklin, knew very much about it. It was a cliche. It was the 5 bloodiest hours of the Civil War. It was the more American generals were killed than any other battle. It was a total futile, wasted moment in American history. And yet, it really wasn't anything. And that was the story. And I wanted desperately to try to talk to a new generation about the Battle of Franklin. And so I finally got up the courage to say something to Mr. Foote that night. And to my surprise, he was favorable. In fact, he was amazingly favorable. He got very excited. He said that he always felt that Franklin was worthy of a great novel. And I'm not saying I've written a great novel, but at least that should be a goal. He told me at one point in the evening, he said, remember, the most important figures who come out of the whole campaign of Atlanta will forever be red and scarlet. And yet at last mention, neither one of them lived. And then eventually, as the evening wore on, he took me in that great English tutor library he had. He had by then inherited Walker Percy, his best friend's entire library. And now Mike and Greg would be drooling over all this and everything. It's an incredible collection of books. And he picked out off of the Douglas Southall Freeman tome, and he opened it up. And now I have to say that this was 12 years ago, and I'm a Southerner and a storyteller, and I've never seen the quote since. So I'll try to get as close as I can recall. But basically, Douglas Southall Freeman said, that contrary to popular opinion, the American Civil War did not end at Appomattox, nor was it won or lost on the battlefield. Though few people know this, it actually ended on a cold December night in 1938 in New Hampshire, when an elderly spinster Skyen sat by the fireplace in her house reading Gone with the Wind, and so empowered by the words of Margaret Mitchell, she screamed out into the silence of that night, "Damn Yankees, damn Yankees." And at that moment, he said, the war was over and the South had won. You know, there's some truth to this whole point. You know, it's like we're always told that history belongs to the victor, but it's really the vanquished who care. You know, when I was in London some time ago for the launch of The Wit of the South in paperback by my English publisher, and I was taken into this very, very chic, the chicest club in London, and I can just imagine, surrounded by all these chic people, if I had said, let's have a toast to the stone of Scone being back where it belongs, that all these very jaded people would have kind of looked at me and then gone back to their world. But let's say I'd been in Perth that night and I had offered the same toast. I'm sure someone would have taken me up on it. You see, we're the ones that care. Now, I don't want to leave this whole story about Shelby Foote without establishing that we did not become lifelong friends. We did communicate, but there was always some distance. In fact, that night when I was leaving his house, about 3 in the morning, even though I didn't own a first edition of his trilogy, I was sure I could find a copy of it. And so and standing on his doorstep with my friend, I said, Mr. Foote, would it be possible for me to send you my copies of the trilogy and have you sign them? And with that same look of horror that I first saw on his face, he turned to me and he said, Mr. Hicks, I'm not accustomed to inscribing books for strangers. Now, so much for the last 7 hours. But anyway, I was telling that story, and a friend of mine said, I have the same exact story. Well, I'm a Southerner. Misery enjoys company. And so I said, do tell me. And he said, well, I was right out of college in the 3rd edition, 3rd volume. I happened to have all 3 of them in my backseat of my car. I was reading the 3rd edition. I was staying with this grand dame of old Memphis, is now passed on. he said, and we were sitting at her kitchen table, and somehow Shelby Foote and the trilogy came up, and I said, and she said, oh, I've known Shelby all his life. And he said, gosh, I would love to have him inscribe the books for me, and sign the books for me. And she said, well, I'll just call him up. And so she goes to one of those wall phones at the time, light blue, with the cord, and she calls up Shelby Foote, and he says, she goes, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, we'll see you later. And she gets off the phone, and he said, he just said the strangest thing. And he said, what? And she said, he said he doesn't inscribe books for strangers. And he said, oh, that's all right. She goes, it's not all right. Get in the car. And so now we're in this late model Cadillac, early 70s, huge car driving through the streets of Memphis, and she's using the curbs as if it's a bumpers. And he said, she's swirling, and cars are swirling. We're going to be killed. And he goes, you know what? I want to die. I would rather die in that car than face this guy who's just told me that he doesn't inscribe books for strangers. We're going to be at his front door, and there we are. 2 tires are up on the sidewalk. She falls out of her side. I'm just trying to get this huge door out. I'm trying to crawl out of the car. She's already halfway up the walkway. Then she's at the front door. She's ringing the doorbell. I'm out. And there's Shelby Foote, and he had got the word. You wouldn't believe the look on his face. And I said, yeah, I would. I've seen it. And he said, Miss So-and-so, I told you. She goes, Shelby, I mean your mama. This is neither appropriate nor Christian behavior. And then she goes, you will. He goes, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. So we're in the house. He's signing my book. All I want at this point, all I want is to get out and just leave. And we're almost to the door, and she turns and she says, Shelby, I don't know anyone else that wants their books inscribed, but I'll find them. I think it's a discipline. I really don't know what that's to do with my story. He's got the $1,500 in inscribed books, and I don't. But anyway, on another occasion, I was driving, and I was listening to, I didn't see Shelby Foote, and I was listening to National Public Radio, and they were interviewing, and I kid you not, the executive director of the Richard III Anti-Defamation Museum in York, England. Now, I've been to York twice. I've been to York Minster. I thought I'd done all the things, but somehow I missed the Richard III Anti-Defamation Museum. But I promise you, on my next trip to York, I will not miss it. And you know, and maybe he's right. Maybe Richard III, you know, really did love children. Maybe Macbeth was a good guy. Maybe Lady Macbeth simply loved a needlepoint. But the point is that they somehow have lost the whole meaning of it all. Oh, if they were with us today, how lucky they would feel that they had Shakespeare. That they live on through the ages because of him. You know, that's the power of historic fiction. It's not just about the facts of the time. It's not about where Robert E. Lee was on a particular morning of February 14th, 1862. But it's about so much more. As we have been told through the ages, as C.S. Lewis once said, there is far more truth to be told in